Hello, I'm Mike Stinger Glenn. Welcome. Today we're going to feature and discuss former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and her struggle for human and civil rights. First of all, she was born in a wealthy family in 1884 in New York. Her mom, Anna Roosevelt, was a socialite, a very beautiful lady, it has been written, and her dad, Elliot, was the younger brother of President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Anna really didn't like the way that her daughter looked and behaved. She even called her granny. Obviously, she wasn't as beautiful, and that's how she treated her. But her dad, Elliot, who had an alcohol problem, actually, loved Eleanor and read to her and carried her places, even introduced her to the writings of Hans Christian Andersen, who had written The Ugly Duckling. Doesn't sound like such a perfect way to tell your daughter those kind of stories, but she loved her dad, and both of them died while Eleanor was still a young lady. Now, later on, she married her distant cousin, very distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, and a political life would start and last the rest of her life. Now, in 1921, her husband Franklin contracted polio and maybe some other disease that left him paralyzed from the waist down for life. He wanted to stop in politics, but she convinced him that he should stay in politics because he was in local politics but having some success. So he continued, and she worked very hard and gave speeches in his stead and influenced women and others to vote for him. And in 1928, he was elected the governor of the state of New York. And we all know that in 1932, he was elected president of the United States and was elected president 4 times. No other person in history has been elected president of the United States 4 different times. And of course, Eleanor was the longest serving First Lady of the United States. Now, in 1927, she invited many women that were head of women's groups to get together and discuss issues that were about women's rights. One lady came from Florida, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. She was head of the National Association of Negro Women, and she was the only black person that was in that meeting. Nobody would sit beside Dr. McLeod Bethune. She had started a university, a school that became a university with 5 little girls, and she had endured, made that school very successful. Today it's Bethune-Cookman University. But Dr. McLeod Bethune, Mary McLeod Bethune, became good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And we have a picture, a couple of pictures on the cover of Ebony magazine that really kind of highlight their relationship. She became an advisor to Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt throughout the presidency, and she remained good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt until Dr. Bethune's death in 1955. So not only was she a friend of the Roosevelts, she introduced other black political leaders to Franklin Roosevelt and had them in the White House where they could share voices about discrimination and lynching. She called her friends, political friends, the Black Cabinet that she had started, and Mrs. Roosevelt would welcome them into the White House and they would discuss things. Dr. Bethune was the head of the Black Cabinet, but you had people like A. Philip Randolph, a brilliant labor leader. You had Walter White, who was executive director of the NAACP, and you had Hamilton, Charles Hamilton, a brilliant attorney that actually taught a lot of lessons to Thurgood Marshall. All of these people were part of the Black Cabinet. Show you a picture of the members of the Black Cabinet, and she was the only woman in the group. But this Black Cabinet was kind of like a parent of the Black Caucus today. They would make recommendations and everything to President Roosevelt, and the Black Cabinet gave them a lot of ideas and helped to steer them toward success for black people and for the country and for democracy. Now, one of the people that I mentioned was Walter White. Walter White had grown up in Atlanta, graduated from Atlanta University, and he had taken over as the executive director of the NAACP, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt joined the NAACP as a member in the 1930s, and she would set up meetings with Walter White and Franklin Roosevelt. Walter White for years had been arguing against lynching and wanted legislation that would make it a federal crime so those who had participated in lynching could be held to the scrutiny of federal authorities. Southerners were totally against this, and they would never support that. And in his investigations, he had gained a lot of fame. Now, Walter White was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed black man named White. But he was head of the NAACP, as I mentioned, and he would go in and sometimes pretend to be white and go to meetings and find out things that were going on about lynchings, etc. And you see him on the cover of Time magazine in 1938. So he met with the president, and President Roosevelt told him that, first he asked him, somebody has been priming you. Was it my wife? So he speculated that he had talked with Eleanor Roosevelt, which he probably had. They spoke many times, and she was a member of the NAACP. And he explained to him, he said, I could never speak out against lynching nor the legislation because the Southern Democrats and Southern voters would just block everything that I'm trying to do. All the New Deal things that I'm trying to do, the Social Security Act and everything to keep the country from collapsing, they would just stop it. And he really had a lot of hard time getting things passed, and he never publicly really spoke out against lynching as far as having legislation against it. But it was something that Eleanor was always against and had always spoken out against and always let her voice be heard. Now, she also culturally met a lot of things in the black community that Dr. Bethune had introduced her to. She would visit black kids, and once in 1935, she visited Detroit, and a young girl named Geraldine Walker, and they exchanged flowers. And it made national news that the First Lady had done this, and it was a picture. And the people in the South, a lot of the whites in the South were really just outraged, and it was called Believe It or Not in a Georgia Woman's World magazine. Here was the First Lady exchanging flowers with a black girl, and it was a beautiful picture that was carried in a lot of books, and it got national publicity with Geraldine Walker and exchanging flowers with the First Lady. And she also, in 1938, visited a nursery in Los Angeles, and that also was a picture that garnered a lot of attention, particularly in the South. And later, the Postal Service in 1998 made a stamp and an envelope showing that this indeed was noteworthy. And Eleanor Roosevelt never backed down from civil rights and human rights and what she believed was right. And you can see the stamp that was made in 1998 and the picture that she took with nursery. Nursery was in 1938, and this one was in 1935 with Geraldine Walker. So as a member of the NAACP, she started her career and her life of activism with her friends and associates from the Black Cabinet, from Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, and the First Lady was on her way to a very different life than the one she started as a wealthy descendant of the Roosevelt family.